Hi, this is Kelly Sadler, the commentary editor at the Washington Times, sitting down with the opinion editor of the Washington Times, Charlie Hurt, and we are interviewing Vivek Ramaswamy today on why he wants to run for president of the United States and why he thinks he can win. This is the Politically Unstable Podcast.
I think you guys know my story, but my parents came to this country 40 years ago with almost no money. I've gone on to found multi-billion-dollar companies. I did it while getting married and having 2 kids and following my faith. And to me, that's my version of the American dream. And I am keen on passing that American dream on to my kids' generation. And I'm in this race because I'm worried about it. I think that young people today are suffering a national identity crisis where the things that used to ground our sense of purpose and meaning in faith, patriotism, hard work, family, these things have disappeared. And I think what's going on in our country is that we're all so starved for meaning, especially young people, so starved for a cause and for purpose that we fill that vacuum with what the modern left serves up: race, gender, sexuality, climate. And then what I see from the right is that we are reactionaries to that. We will say, no, not that, not this, not that, for these reasons. And of course, we'll win the argument, I think, on the merits. But that's not moving the ball forward for the country because the void still persists. And so I'm in this race to actually offer an affirmative vision that fills that void with an alternative to what the left serves up. They give us race, gender, sexuality, climate. I want to talk about the value of the individual, the family, the nation, God, which I do not think should be a 4-letter word in our culture. And what I'm seeing is that even more than I expected it more than everybody who advised me otherwise at the start of this campaign, but even more than I expected it, that message is resonating deeply with certainly conservatives across this country. But what gives me hope is even individuals who extend far beyond the conservative base. And now I'm moved on to, when I started this race, it felt like I was jumping off of a cliff into an unknown depth. But I think we found our bearings. And I think that I couldn't have said this on day one with conviction. I can say with conviction today that I truly believe we're going to be successful in not just winning this election. And I think winning it in a landslide is what I expect to deliver. But I'm hopeful in leading a national revival where I think much more about what I want to be saying in January 2033 than what I want to be saying in November 2024. And there's a few things that I know I can deliver for this country. I think I have the deepest understanding of anybody who's run for president in the last 30 years of how to shut down the administrative state. Tomorrow, and we can talk about that with you all too, but tomorrow night I'm going to be delivering that speech, at least the first version of it, in St. Anselm in New Hampshire. I think I have the deepest understanding of how to actually declare economic independence from our adversary, Communist China, in a way that has never been true in our national history and I think should not be true today. I think I have a deep understanding of how to grow our economy. I think this is one where other candidates probably share an instinct for the right things too, but I have an understanding of it coming from the private sector. But I think more than anything else, and I think the most important part of this and what I want to say when I leave office in January 2033, is that young Americans are once again proud to be citizens of this country. And my purpose of being in this race, my purpose of hopefully leading this country is that I'm 37, right? I'm the first millennial ever to run in our party. I would be the youngest president ever elected, if elected. I think I am best positioned of anyone in either party to reach that next generation and revive that missing national pride by first filling that vacuum, filling that void. And I think that's the next step in our conservative movement.
So and I agree with you. You said that we have the arguments on our side, meaning conservatives, but we're not winning those arguments. Why are those arguments not winning today?
Because I think the vacuum is not a mental vacuum. It's a sort of spiritual vacuum, actually. I don't just mean spiritual in the religious sense, but it is an emotional vacuum. I think the vacuum of purpose and identity and the hunger for cause goes beyond argument, goes to the guttural, the human need, the thing that separates us from animals. Actually, there's two things, I guess. I suppose it separates us from animals, but animals can think, right? In a sense, they can apply a reason of what's in their self-interest or not to get that piece of food or jump up for that bone. And we human beings have those instincts too. That's part of it. That's almost the thinking side of our brain. But what differentiates us from animals is that we can believe in something bigger than ourselves. And I think the beauty of America is that we're a country founded on a set of ideals. So in a certain sense, it's a nation founded on the essence of the very thing that makes us human. It's founded on the essence of our humanity. And I think that there's complicated reasons for this that go beyond politics, but we live in a moment in our history when the things that used to fill our need for that higher purpose, hungering to be part of something bigger than ourselves, when that thing bigger than ourselves has disappeared, whatever it is, God, pledging allegiance, you don't bend the knee to God, you're going to bend the knee to something. You don't pledge allegiance to the flag, you're going to pledge allegiance to something. That's what's happening in our culture. And so arguing about the fact of someone pledging allegiance to the wrong thing is not persuasive to someone who has the need to pledge allegiance to something, right? What that person really needs is not an argument about what their climate God is wrong, although I will give you plenty of reasons for why. But what they really need is something else bigger than themselves to believe in. And we have not been serving that up as conservatives. And so then we have climate. So, I mean, it's in a nutshell.
And I don't want to dwell on this, but just to button this up. But I can't, is it intentional?
On whose part?
On who are we up against?
Yeah.
And is this an intentional effort to replace that spirituality with something else?
I think it is, but I think the intentionality is perpetrated by a small number of people, right? Largely self-interested actors, very effectively. That is the woke industrial complex. I mean, that is the essence of my first book. I don't know if you guys have read it. Yeah, read Woke Inc. Woke Inc. is about, thank you. You read it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is about the cynical forces that prey on those insecurities. But, my second book, Nation of Victims, and then more of this campaign is further in the direction of, it does take two to tango, right? So you do have cynical forces that are incredibly effective at preying on those psychic insecurities. And I think I have been, among others, effective in elucidating what those cynical forces are, to be able to see them with clear eyes. There's a time and place for that, and that's important to understand and combat. But I think ultimately the best defense is offense, and offense by way of actually filling that void that immunizes us from cynical exploitation. And I think that's what's going on in the country today. And I think the conservative movement, we've become complacent in satisfying ourselves with almost the ease, the comfort, the habit of dismantling the cynical forces as they've become exposed. It's easier to do now than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. It's hard when I wrote Woke Inc. Now railing against ESG is easy. And the people the cynical actors who perpetrated this are now running to new terms because they realize they're on their heels. But that's not winning us the long run battle, right? That's just a short-term victory in a broader, I hesitate using this word, but it's the best I can think of right now, spiritual tug of war. And I think we got to serve up the real thing. And I don't see anybody in our movement, certainly from a position of political leadership, stepping up to actually do it.
And part of what's so effective about it is getting us to get all worked up about these things.
Yes.
And then they can get...
It's a deflection tactic. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you see cynical forces at play in the Republican Party on the conservative side?
I had to think about that. My first reaction is not cynical. Not in the same way. But I'd have to think about that more because my second reaction is to say that my diagnosis is right. It would be surprising if that didn't exist in our party in the same way. I'd have to think about it more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do your children go to public school?
They're not in school yet. One's 3 years old. He's 3.5 soon. as he would remind me, and one's 1 year old, so they're young. We're thinking about the full gamut of options from homeschooling to public school. My wife and I, on one hand, have a strong disposition to public schools because both of us did through, grade school through eighth grade, at least in both of our cases. And I think both of us went to not that great of public schools, but we think that was actually a formative part of our experience. On the other hand, I do worry about the quality and character of education. And we think about the other extreme of homeschooling quite seriously. And if you asked us before we had kids, or even soon after we had our first son, if we were ever going to consider homeschooling, I would have said that was a crazy idea. But actually today we're contemplating both options pretty seriously.
So you've brought up eliminating the Department of Education.
Yeah.
Why do you think you can do that? I mean, you're talking huge stuff here,
Yeah.
pie in the sky type stuff. You've never been in government.
I think it's very practical, actually. But yeah, so to the professional advisor class, most of them will tell me much of what I want to do requires Congress or requires, other forms of action. You need somebody who has a bone deep enough conviction to still say, notwithstanding advice to the contrary, I'm doing it. And then we'll take it to the Supreme Court. And I've studied the Supreme Court, and I think we'll win. But that's a really rare combination, and that's why I think I'm uniquely
So you're saying that rare combination is more formidable than Trump's rare combination because
Trump brought one of those elements. I bring the second, which is a deep first personal understanding. That's why he put Betsy DeVos on top of the Department of Education instead of shutting it down. That's why he did not actually secure the southern border with the military, because there's incorrect assumptions about posse comitatus after the Civil War and Reconstruction. There's incorrect assumptions about whether or not the president can actually reorganize a federal department without the authority of Congress. Whereas I understand the 1977 Presidential Reorganization Act, or at least the provisions of it that are as yet unexpired, or 5 U.S.C. 3302, which gives the U.S. president the sole authority to set the regulations governing the HR department known as the Office of Personnel Management. I understand that the civil service protections protect individual employees from firing, but on their own terms do not apply to mass layoffs. Mass layoffs is exactly what I'll bring to the city.
That's the question. You made a comment about the difference about Trump was bringing some of this business elements, but you kind of made an indication that he didn't have some of the background that you have. Can you differentiate your business experience to his business experience and what it would mean to an administration?
We've run very different kinds of businesses, so I don't want to take anything away from his success. And to be really frank about it, I really don't know much about his business experiences, actually. And so I respect people who have succeeded through the private sector in this country. That's great. He seems to be one of them. I think one of the things is my experience. Thank you, is we can just leave here. Yeah, is my experience is that there's a special skill set required to build something from scratch. That's different to come in and run a family enterprise that's existed for a long time. I did not inherit any wealth. I created it myself. And I think that that's just a different experience and journey. So I don't know much about which of those specifics apply to him, but my sense is there's some differences there. But, by and large, I respect anybody who's had success outside of government and made a positive contribution by providing people things they want, at a price that they're willing to pay that's higher than what it takes for you to provide it to them. That's how capitalism works. And so I do think he brings that skill set. But I think the element that was missing, it's not that I'm going to say my business experience was, better than his business experience. Just nature of our businesses were different. But I think the real difference is the first personal understanding of the U.S. Constitution and the laws of this country. And that's not new for me. I mean, that's even in my background in science, I was studied science in undergrad, but I was the chairman of the Harvard Political Union. I always had this separate interest. I went to law school even during my years as a biotech investor because I was scratching an itch that I always had. And I think that that's a unique combination where I don't think the president of the United States is necessarily more important than many other roles across this country that are going to be required for our national revival. I just think each of us has to look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, how are we going to make the maximal use of our talents to make this country more successful? And for me, as ridiculous as it might sound, I think my honest reckoning was I worry about a missing national identity in the next generation of Americans. I worry that my kids and their generation will not be able to live the same American dream that I did. When I look myself in the mirror and ask myself how I can play my unique role in leading the revival of our country, it turns out I think that rare combination is what's going to be required. And that is what called me into this race in a way that even a year ago I would have told you would have been unthinkable. And yet I think something happened last December that really called me into this race. I do think we traveled the country as part of my second book tour, where there's something about it where you're traveling the country and you're not even thinking about running for US president. And there's 4 or 5 people that come up after every event that you don't know and have never met and tell you to do something as preposterous as to run for president. And then it happens consistently. That then becomes a hard idea to shake off. But at the end of last year, that was the conclusion I came to, is this is how I would make my unique contribution. But it's still going to require everybody else across the country, from parents to teachers to state legislators to cultural leaders to business leaders, to each play their role in our national revival as well.
It is kind of remarkable to stop and think about how, I don't think anyone, maybe people disagree with your prescriptions and stuff, but I don't think anybody would disagree with you that it is, as Seth points out, an impossibility to imagine reforming the Department of Education. And
it's impossible.
And the fact that just one department of the federal government is so completely untamable, and that's just one of them.
One of hundreds.
Yeah, that this is somehow an acceptable state of our politics.
Yeah.
That you can't just elect somebody. The people can't elect somebody and then have the government reformed to suit the people that elected that person to make those changes.
See, I have a radical proposition that I will bring to Washington, D.C. It is not a Republican proposition or a Democratic proposition. It is the idea that the people who we elect to run the government ought to be the ones who actually run the government. That is the simple bargain of the American experiment. That was the bargain of the American Revolution, right? That the people, whoever they are, right? We may agree with them, we may disagree with them, the people who we elect ought to be the ones who actually run the government. And honest to God, we fought a revolution in 1776 for an idea that now we seem to have abandoned. If George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton or John Adams were walking the streets of Washington, D.C. today, they disagree with each other on a lot of things, but they would be equally aghast at what they see, the technocracy, the aristocracy that we left the old world for the new to create has now been abandoned at the hands of not only the 3-letter alphabet soup in Washington, D.C., but a managerial class that actually horizontally pervades the private sector. The associate dean of God knows what at a university sucks the lifeblood out of a university in the same way that the 3-letter agency heads and their bureaucrats under them suck the lifeblood out of our constitutional republic. The same goes for the HR bureaucracy at most major large companies today. This is the real political divide in our country between the managerial class and the everyday citizen. I sometimes call it the Great Reset and the Great Uprising. And I think that this is the debate between our own party, within our own party. Party I'm part of, even though I don't think that's the most important distinction. Do you believe in reform or do you believe in revolution? And I'm the candidate. I think the sole candidate who is actually unapologetically on the side of revolution. I think that's the only way forward. I think it's actually the more practical way forward. I think that this would seem like an extreme idea. Actually, the thing that's extreme is if our founding fathers came to walk the streets of Washington, D.C. today, this is extreme, right? The idea that the people we elected to run a government actually running the government, that's not the extreme idea. That's the essence of the American experiment. And yet, the fact that not just that we have that government in Washington, D.C. that behaves this way, that federal bureaucracy, but the fact that dismantling that bureaucracy and the same idea within a university, a private institution or otherwise, the fact that that idea of totally dismantling an existing bureaucracy seems extreme says a lot about the state of a culture and how far that culture itself has migrated. So half the problem is not even the bureaucracy, but the cultural expectations that has created that this is actually the norm, and the restoration of what is true is actually that which is extreme. That, I think, is actually the real problem in our country, and it pervades both political parties, the Democratic Party arguably more so than the Republican one today. But that vision is also part of what I think our conservative grassroots base understands deeply, and probably accounts for our early rise and success in this campaign. Is that I think that's the message people are most responsive to, and it's what happens to be the objective that pulled me into this race in the first place.
And it's interesting that it's the among voters and politicians, it's the conservatives are the only ones talking about the revolution.
That's right, and because I'm actually not talking about conserving, right?
Right.
The thing that we would have wanted to conserve does not exist. I don't want to conserve this bureaucracy.
But it exists down there, but it's been covered over by so much.
Yeah, I mean, I want to conserve the ideals enshrined in the Constitution. I mean, do those ideals still exist? I believe somewhere deep down in there they do. But we're going to have to do a lot of hard work to revive them, and that's what this whole project is about. I think the same way that Trump beat the people who were ahead at this time in 2015. So I believe we will be successful in winning this primary. I believe we'll be successful in delivering a landslide election in the general. We haven't even had the first debate yet. And I'm a candidate who started at 0.0% in March, which is not that long ago when I entered this race. And I'm polling at third in the Republican primary, where many people in this country don't even know who I am yet. Right? Our name ID compared to the other major candidates is low, and I'm already polling at third. That says that of the people who have heard of me, we're bringing them along and bringing them along fast. I think there are many Trump voters across the country, at least we see them in rooms of 100 or 200 at a time. But in places like Iowa, I mean, just last week, several people come up and they're wearing Trump hats at my event. They say, I'm an always Trumper. But you have put me in an uncomfortable position. This is an exact quote from the woman who came up. She says, you put me in an uncomfortable position. It's actually the first thing she said. So I was like, oh, what did I do? She says, you put me in an uncomfortable position. I'm an always Trumper. She's wearing a Trump hat. And yet you have me on the fence. I said, we're sitting in July. That's a fine place to be. I'm not going to, I said, keep listening. You don't have to focus on the who today. Focus on the what and the why. What do we stand for? Why do we stand for it? I'm going to be back here more. Come to more of our events, and you make your choice next year.
What's Trump's biggest weakness? And if you could delineate or detail two policy differences you have.
a lot of your campaign is very focused on domestic issues, America First. But where Trump is going to come at you is on foreign policy on the international stage. What makes you so sure that you can deal with foreign leaders
So in my faith, I believe in God. I believe there's one true God. We see Jesus Christ as a son of God. But more importantly, I'm not running for pastor in chief. I'm running for U.S. commander in chief. And in leading this nation, there's something you should know about me is that I was not raised in a Christian household. I'm a Hindu, and I raised my kids in the same tradition. But we share the same Judeo-Christian values that this nation was founded on deeply. And part of the reason I'm able to stand for religious liberty and the revival of faith as clearly and unapologetically as I have is perhaps because I am a member of a younger generation. Perhaps it is because no one's going to accuse me of being a Christian nationalist. Not credibly anyway.
Can you enumerate
along the way?
Can you enumerate some of the overlapping values?
Yeah, sure. The easy ones to start with are more lifestyle-based, important. Family, right? We live our lives according to the premise that I think this country was founded on, that any flourishing society has been founded on, that the nuclear family is the best known form of governance to mankind. That's the ultimate privilege that I had growing up in. It's the privilege we try to give our two sons. But I think it runs deeper than that. I think the common, and thank you for asking that question, because I hear the word Judeo-Christian values a lot without people ever stopping to pause and remind ourselves what those values were. Sacrifice is one of those values. Duty is one of those values. Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. He didn't actually have to make the sacrifice, but then God in the New Testament sacrifices his son to the people because that's what the people needed. That runs through. I mean, I didn't read the Bible. I've read the Bible, but I never read it for the first time. I didn't feel like I read it for the first time. I went to Catholic schools because these are ideals that are deeply woven into my own faith-based tradition, my own family upbringing of sacrifice, doing your duty, the belief that God put us here for a reason. It is our job to carry out God's plan, whatever that plan is that he has for us. These are deeply ingrained values, not only into my bones, but into the Judeo-Christian foundation upon which this country was built. Civic duty, I think, is an unspoken common thread through the Constitution that we actually have long forgotten in this country, which is why I come back to policy ideas like the fact that a young person should have to pass the same civics test that an immigrant has to pass or else serve the country for 6 months. That sounds radical to some people. It's actually an instantiation of Judeo-Christian values that this nation was founded on. And so I think part of the answer is honesty. I'm not going to pretend to be something that I'm not. I think Christians value honesty. I think most human beings value honesty. And that's why I think we're going to be successful in bringing particularly faith-based communities, including evangelical Christians, along with us. Because the objective of what we're going to achieve, it's not just a bargain. And I think they've done that before. It's not just all right, we'll do the deal and you give us the justices you want. Right? That's a trade. I think I'm running to be a president. The standard I want to be held to is that I want to lead this country and even live my life as a parent, as a father, and as a president. That parents, including Christian parents across this country, can look their kids in the eye and tell them in good conscience that I want you to grow up and be like him. It's not a bargain. Yes, we'll get the good judicial appointments, right? We'll stand for religious liberty, but it's not a deal. It's because it's who I am. It's who we are. And so far, I think that people are incredibly open to that. And I think the trick will be how we translate doing that in a room of 200 people to a nation of 200 million people. Maybe you guys, have views on digital distribution of your content or something like that.
We'll do our part.
But that's the trick. And I think that'll be the difference between whether or not we ultimately see this through and succeed. But if those pipes work as well as what we're doing in a room works, I think I'll be the next president. And more importantly than being the next president, be in a position to lead a national revival over the next 8 years. But, my job's to say who I am and what we stand for. The job of the voter is to decide who they want to cast their ballot for. And, we'll do our part. And I have faith that the voters will do theirs.
Well, that's it, folks. Thanks so much for listening to this podcast, and you can read more at thewashingtontimes.com.